Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Morgan Woodard, and today my project for our Homeland Security class is going to be emergency response to active threats. Before I get into my discussion, I just want to tell you a little bit about me. My name, like I said, is Morgan. I did 9 years in the Coast Guard. I was a gunner's mate there. I did everything from weapons maintenance to Homeland Security. Stateside, I did some stuff deployed. I also did I'm currently employed as a police officer, where I've been for the last 5 years here in Seward. When I was in the Coast Guard, I did training for tactical combat casualty care, close quarters battle. I was a firearms instructor. Since becoming a police officer, I'm now the school resource officer. I've been through ERACE, which is the external response to active shooter environments. I just finished up training and I'm now certified as an active shooter threat instructor. And I'm getting ready to go next week to learn tactical medicine for active shooter environments. So I'll be an instructor with that. In addition to all that, I'm also a volunteer with the fire department and I'm an EMT. So this whole active shooter, active threat thing is something that is kind of near and dear to my heart. So, in true, government fashion, we're going to go over some objectives before we get into it. So today we're going to talk about and we're going to define what it actually is an active threat. We're going to discuss the history behind lockdowns inside of schools. We're going to analyze the traditional response, both from law enforcement, medical, emergency response side, and from the schools. We're going to talk about Columbine High School and how it completely changed the way law enforcement responds to these kind of incidents. We're also going to do a brief overview of the active threat incidents. Just there's been a lot of them. We're just going to talk about a couple of them and some of the lessons learned in those. And then we're going to talk about the new non-traditional response, both from law enforcement, medical, and school administrator sides. So the FBI did a study back in 2014, and it studied all active shooter incidents from 2000 to 2013. What they found was there's been 160 incidents that has resulted in 1,043 casualties. That's both killed and wounded. So obviously this is a big issue. This comes out to an average of 11.4 incidents a year. 60% of these incidents uh, finished. They were done by the time cops showed up on scene. All but two of the incidents involved just a single shooter, and 40% of these incidents, the shooters committed suicide. The big takeaway from that is these shooters, these bad guys, are highly motivated, and this is the last thing they want to do before they go out. So that kind of presents a different risk and a different sort of bad guy than what police are normally dealing with, because hostage negotiators taking time to investigate this stuff doesn't work. We need to get in there and we need to stop them fast. All right. So this is just a graph showing you year by year the different active shooters. The numbers not a huge. I mean, obviously they're a big deal. Not a huge point here. The takeaway is that line. It's getting more and more every year. It used to be, when Columbine happened, it rocked everybody because it was not something that was commonplace. But now it seems you can't go a month without hearing about someplace being shot up or somebody driving a vehicle through a crowd. This whole active threat is becoming more and more commonplace. So, what is an actual active threat? It used to be called an active shooter. You'll hear me go back and forth because this has been a fairly new change. But a lot of the folks, like at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, they're referring to them as active threats because it doesn't just take a gun to do this. People have used knives, bombs, vehicles. This seems to be the in vogue way to cause a lot of casualties. So we call them active threats. So there's three factors involved in what is an actual active threat. First, obviously, the threat has to be actively engaged in causing death or serious injury. The incident has to contain a large number of victims, and the incident is ongoing when law enforcement arrives. Those are the criteria for an active threat situation. So, school's traditional response for an active threat situation was lockdown. Everybody in this class probably remembers what a lockdown is. You train, you get underneath your desk, you get quiet, you turn off the lights, and you hope that they bypass your room. You hope that the lock holds. You hope that they're just going to move on and you're going to be okay. All right. This was the general response for all active shooter stuff. did a little bit of digging, and some folks with the Alice Institute, which we'll talk about later on in the presentation, found out that this was developed as a response to drive-by shootings. The first lockdown they found was from an inner city school, and it was as a response to gang violence and drive-by shootings at the school. So it's really effective when you look at what it was originally designed for, because the threat's on the outside, the threat can't get inside. Just stay low, stay small, and then there's a really good chance that you're not going to be hit by anything and you can go about your day. The problem becomes when the threat isn't outside, the threat is inside the school. Because what you have, and you'll hear me mention static versus dynamic several times in this presentation, you have a static target. You have targets that are not moving, and we were training kids and teachers to just lay there and hope rather than be prepared and move. So, traditional spots for law enforcement. Responding law enforcement would establish a perimeter. The SWAT team would enter, or SWAT team would be called. They would come and enter, and then they would eliminate the threat and do using a slow and methodical search. It's the same thing with like CQB, all these things. You go in and you make sure you cover everything. You don't want to leave any stone unturned, because that stone might be hiding a bad guy underneath them. This picture right here is a picture of the Columbine incident. And the media skewered law enforcement because while kids were inside dying, the cops were outside hiding behind their police cars. What you need to understand is that was how they were trained. These cops were not prepared or trained for an active shooter incident. I mean, these vehicles are a long ways from the school, and you can see both of them have handguns. Neither of them have a rifle. The national average for response times for once SWAT gets called out is 50 minutes. And the average response time for a first law enforcement on scene is 11 minutes. And the thing to remember about that is that's a national average. So places in like LA, Detroit, New York, where they have an active SWAT team on shift, they skew those numbers. For example, if we have God forbid, we had an active shooter in Seward, it would take upwards to 3 or 4 hours before the state trooper CERT team would be here in Seward with boots on ground. That's 3 or 4 hours where it's just, little old Officer Woodard, holding down the fort. So I want to compare those times with the time the average active threat ends in 12 and a half minutes. So the average threat ends in a minute and a half after the cop shows up on scene. Columbine High School. Before we get into these, I want to just throw out a disclaimer. I absolutely refuse to mention any of these shooters by name because they were looking for notoriety, and I refuse to give them that satisfaction even after they died. But I'm sure everybody knows who we're talking about. So Columbine High School, April 20th, 1999. Two high school students decided they were going to end their lives, but before they're going to end their lives, they're going to take the lives of their fellow classmates. They killed 13 people and they wounded 23. They ended up shooting each other or shooting themselves and died by suicide after the fact. All right, these guys were highly trained. They had planned this stuff out. But actually, before the shooting started happening, they set off a bomb at a different location in an attempt to distract law enforcement and fire to give them more time to walk around the schools. As you can see in this picture here, there's students underneath those tables, and they're doing exactly what lockdown taught them to do. They're hiding. Like the two gunmen are in complete control of that room right now. I want to go over the timeline for just a minute, just to kind of really drive home the point that this traditional response does not work for active threat incidents. So at 11:19 hours on April 20th, first 911 call comes in. That call wasn't for shots fired, though. That was for the bomb that went off at a different location. So at 11:19, first 911 call comes in. At 11:25 hours, shots fired is called out over the radio. School resource officer on scene got the first word out that there was shooting going on. At 11:33 hours, 8 minutes later, SWAT team was paged. At 11:44, 11 hours later, the perimeter was secured. On duty or responding officers was able to hold down the area around Columbine and contain it. So that way, bad guys couldn't get out and get away because cops trying to investigate. We want to make sure we catch the bad guy now and don't let him get away and hurt other people. 11:49 hours, SWAT arrives. So between 11:33 and 11:49, I mean, that's still pretty quick for a SWAT page and them to be on scene. But that's a long time when you have active killing going on. 12:06, SWAT enters the building, and at 12:08, the gunmen killed themselves. That was their plan all along. As soon as police showed up, the gig was up. And so that was the whole point of the bomb beforehand. That was the whole point of everything, was to try to prolong the amount of time they could do damage. So 12:08, the gunman killed themselves. Here's the bad one. At 16:45, the initial sweep is finished and the gunmen are found. 4 hours. Because the SWAT team was doing their methodical search. You know, you check every room, make sure everything's okay. That's the way we've always been trained. 4 hours before the gunmen were found and the initial sweep was done. The reason this is important is because we'll get into it a little bit more later. Like, medical is trained not to go in until the scene is safe. It took 4 hours before that school was deemed safe and they could send medics in. People were bleeding to death and dying that could have been saved had we gotten medics in a lot sooner than that. So, takeaways from this. The killers were allowed to roam the hallways for 43 minutes after the first officer knew that there was killing going on. 43 minutes. Traditional response is way, way too static. It's a formulaic idea for responding to these things, and it does not work. Killers utilize bombs as diversionary tactics to dilute response. So you set a bomb off over here, and everybody responds that direction while you go over here and you do bad things. All right? Police cannot afford to wait for specialized teams. When it comes to active shooter, active killing type stuff, you cannot wait. Other notable active threat incidents and lessons learned. One of the big takeaways from all this, people need to understand, law enforcement is always going to be reactionary. It does not matter how well prepared, how skookum, or how awesome you are, like, it's going to be reactionary. We have to learn from past events. It's been proven that killers research other active threat incidents to learn and tweak their process. You know, the guy from Virginia Tech looked back at Columbine and learned from what he saw there. Every active shooter goes through and they do their research and they practice and they train. And, well, that didn't work for those guys, so I'm going to try something a little different. So today we're just going to look at a few of them. We're going to look at Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, the Navy Yard shooting, and the Pulse nightclub. So Virginia Tech, April 16, 2007. One shooter died by suicide. The interesting thing about this was there was two separate attacks, if you want to call them. He had his initial attack where he killed 2 people in a dorm room, and then over 2 hours later, he started his main assault on the dorms and killed 30 people. I'm sorry, the classrooms, and killed 30 people. This attack lasted 9 minutes, and so in 9 minutes he was able to kill 30 people. One of the big takeaways from this, he chained the doors that he knew law enforcement was probably going to respond through. So he chained those doors. It slowed them down. They had to go back, get breaching tools, and figure out a way to break through that door. The whole time, this guy's inside killing. One of the other huge takeaways from this is the classrooms that hid and went into lockdown had a much higher fatality rate than those that ran. There were 2 separate classrooms, and I can't remember the specific numbers, but there's a classroom here on the left, and they hid down, hunkered, and went into lockdown mode. He was able to break through that door, and he killed something like 60-70% of the people in that room. Versus this classroom over here on the right, yeah, they locked the door, but then they started bailing out the windows. I think he only got 2 people in that classroom, something like that. I mean, it was a stark difference. Like, lockdown does not work in these kinds of situations. Sandy Hook. Okay, so everybody knows about Sandy Hook. December 14th, 2012. You know, this horrible human being comes into the elementary school, kills 6 adults and 20 students. Okay, again, he killed himself once the cops were in the building. The cops didn't even get a chance to go in and engage this guy. As soon as the police showed up, he knew the gig was over, he killed himself. Okay, he accessed classrooms where children were locked down. They were static targets. Right? Some of those adults were absolutely heroes. They died heroes trying to protect those kids. But the fact is, when you have a room and you have a group of people caged into the corner of a room, and you're trying to do unspeakable acts of evil, like, not moving it just makes it easier for the killer. So the Navy Yard. This one's not quite as well known as Sandy Hook or those other ones, but basically there was a deranged, for lack of a better term, employee who walked through and was just killing his fellow coworkers. September 16, 2013, there's one shooter. This one was shot by police officers. But before they were able to get to him, he killed 12 people and wounded 8 others. This is one of the ones I would argue that anybody who commits an active shooter or a mass casualty event like this is mentally ill. But this guy had a documented case of mental illness. All right, he was killed by an ad hoc response team. Like there was this, I was pretty happy to hear about these guys. You know, they were sitting there, they were kind of pinned down, and that we have to go in. We cannot wait. We can't wait for SWAT team or whoever. We need to go find this guy. So they began to hunt for the bad guy. They went through and they located him. They shot him and killed him. Who knows how high the death toll would have been if they had waited. Then the Pulse nightclub down in Orlando. This one was fairly recent, June 12th, 2016. There was one shooter. Interesting one about this is he transitioned from an active shooter to a barricaded suspect, which for law enforcement is two completely different responses. He killed 50 people and wounded 53. That's a huge number, but I want to point out that the reason that number is so high is because he went in and he fired into the dance floor of a packed club. Okay, an off-duty law enforcement officer was there. He shot at the suspect within minutes, which made the guy run and hide. He hid inside the bathroom, became a barricaded suspect. Huge difference. So that's when police officers can slow down and they can treat him like a barricaded suspect. You start doing your hostage negotiation, you get people out, take care of what you need to take care of. Right? But again, this showcases how important it is to get a law enforcement officer on scene as soon as possible. Because if he was able to kill 50 people and wound 53 within minutes, how many more would have died had that guy not been there? So here's some common themes throughout all of this. Each one of these tends to be one or two people, one or two shooters. The ones that have two shooters are generally their husband and wife or their close friends, like the Columbine. They pick high population targets because the whole point is to create as much hate, discontent, and sorrow as they can. They set traps for law enforcement officers. These are things that police need to be aware of. They usually commit suicide upon law enforcement officers' arrival. Again, they're just trying to hurt as many people as fast as they can, and the second somebody comes to stop them, they give up. So, after some of the lessons learned from these different active shooter stuff, we've kind of come up with this, what we call the non-traditional response. Traditional response meaning we set up a perimeter, we wait, we take it methodically. Non-traditional response, first guy on scene goes in. First guy with a gun, you're heading on in. You run towards stimulus. So we have two things. We have stimulus and indicators. Stimulus tells you where the shooter is inside the building. So gunfire, people screaming, he's that way, follow shell casing, stuff like that. If you have stimulus like that, you're going. They call it eye washing the rooms as you're running by them, but you're not messing with clearing these rooms as you're heading in there. You're trying to get to the stimulus as fast as possible so you can engage the threat. As soon as you engage the threat, threat's down, you step back and go into the investigative. If you don't know where the threat location is, so you're in a big school, all you hear is just general screaming and crying, nothing really to indicate which direction he is, that's when you kind of slow down a little bit, and not as slow as we've done in the past. We do what was called limited penetration searches. So instead of, in the past, we would go in and we would search the entire room. Now we're just at the doorway, kind of doing a quick look around, make sure that, see what's in there, see if you see any dead bodies, anything like that, and then move on. Again, fast. And the other important thing with traditional response is because you have one officer, or if you're lucky, two officers that go in, you're going to have backup coming. So we have to establish link up with the incoming backup. This is critically important for law enforcement because if you have an active shooter situation and you're running around inside of a school with a gun, you want to make sure the good guys know that you're also a good guy. So how do we prepare the beat cop for this? In order to properly respond, the beat cop, the average officer out of the academy, needs to be prepared. He needs to have the kind of proper training to expect, what are you going to see when you walk into this kind of situation? Are you going to be okay with dealing what you have to deal with? They need the proper equipment. There's a big argument in law enforcement circles right now about the militarization of the police. And I understand where they're coming from because our police are not military. And I'm a huge advocate of community-oriented policing. Your police officer should be somebody you can come up to and talk to. But at the same time, when the metal hits the meat, we need to be preparing our law enforcement officers and equipping them so they can respond to the threat. And all you have to do is look at the North Hollywood shootout back in the 90s to see what happens when our cops are outgunned. And then the proper mindset. This is huge. We go over this in the academy all the time. We talk about mindset, mindset, mindset. You have to prepare yourself for the worst to make sure that you're ready. Some considerations for the non-traditional response. Here's some, psychologically, the police officers and medics and people who go in have to understand that you're going to see carnage. It's going to look like a horror movie in there. Blood everywhere, screaming, possibly smoke, alarms going off. You have to be okay with the fact that you may have to take a child's life. In Columbine, both those shooters were under the age of 18. Those were kids. They were the age of my children. Okay, but you have to accept that fact early, because if you hesitate when you have an active shooter situation, more lives can be lost. You have to bypass the injured. This is probably going to be the hardest part for me. God forbid, I hope this never happens. But I have a tendency to want to help. As an EMT, I want to get in there, stop the bleeding, help people, and save lives. But if you're dealing with an active shooter as a law enforcement officer, you have to understand you're going. Like, priority of life is you have to stop the dying before you have to stop the killing before you can stop the dying. Physiological considerations, I'm not going to get into too much here. It's the same stuff with any kind of fight or flight response. If you're interested, look up Cooper's color codes. They're really, really interesting. But your physiological response, you have auditory exclusion, tunnel vision, loss of fine motor skills. It's kind of general, like whenever you get into a really high stress environment, just understand that that's going to happen. And so you need to take a little bit of time, maybe slow down just a minute to make sure you're seeing everything, because you don't want to bypass or miss anything. So being prepared, as a law enforcement officer, one always has to be prepared for the worst day of their life. If you wait until that day to decide if you got what it takes, you're going to be disappointed. You're not going to respond to what you take. We call it when-then thinking in the academy. Like, instead of if-then thinking, like, if this happens, I'll do this. When this happens, I'll do that. Just to kind of prepare yourself and make sure you're ready. Medical response, I'm not going to get into too much about this because a lot of this has to do with law enforcement. But, in the traditional response, medics always waited in the cold zone until the scene was safe. So they would wait outside, beyond the yellow tape, and then once cops said, okay, all of the bad guys are secured, then they would come in and they would treat the wounded. As we saw in the Columbine timeline, that led to a lot of people dying. 44 hours is an excruciatingly long time when you've got a bullet inside you and you're bleeding. Many of those people that bled out and died, they could have been saved. And I'm not blaming medics at all. This is how they were trained, because medics aren't, they're not, I don't want to use the word combatants, but they're not the ones who are going to go in there and fight the bad guy. They're the ones who come in there and save lives. And so we want to keep our medics safe. So we've always told them, stay over here. Okay. Non-traditional response, it incorporates tactical combat casualty care. Okay. We're not worried about, are you allergic to this, or what's your medical history? It's slap on tourniquets, put on occlusive dressings if they got bullet holes in their chest, get their airway open, and get them the hell out of there so they can get help inside the ambulance in the cold zone. Okay, so triage and self-treatment is huge. Okay, one of the things that we teach our officers when you're responding to an active threat is you can teach people to self-treat themselves. So yell at somebody, have you been shot? Put your hand over the bullet hole. Put pressure on it. You can walk somebody through setting up a tourniquet. That way you can get them to self-treat themselves. One of the cool things, too, we haven't set up here locally yet, but I'm hoping to get there, is our medics come in with second wave LEO. As you can see in the picture up there, some places their medics have body armor. Some places they have a medic with their SWAT team. And so they come in with second wave, and they only go into the warm zone. Obviously, we're not going to have medics sitting there with bullets zinging over their head trying to help people. But if the warm zone being like the part of the school that the bad guy's not in, you can get them in there and start treating people and start saving lives. All right, so that's all law enforcement and emergency response, kind of how we have changed. We've gone from slow, static, methodical, investigative, like that's how law enforcement works, to a faster, quicker, like get in there and get things done and stop the killing. Right? School response, again, static versus dynamic. One of the things that we always talk about is people are only going to do what they're trained for in an emergency. When you start panicking, you're going to fall back to your lowest level of training. So if we train people to just sit and hide and cower underneath a desk, that's what they're going to do. Even if the bad guy comes through the door and is standing there, they're just going to just sit there and cower and hope that they're not the ones who get shot. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to leave that up to the person with the gun in their hand. So lockdowns, they only work if the door holds. That's not the case often because these guys watch, they listen, they learn, they know. Like there's not a single person in this country that understands that if you're walking on the school with a gun, every teacher and student are going to sit down and hide in a classroom. So the whole idea of if we turn the lights off, maybe they'll think it's empty doesn't work anymore. And so now we have seen case reports where they bring in breaching tools to force doors, right? Disrupting the OODA loop saves lives. The OODA loop, real quick, is observe, orient, direct, and act. Everybody does that whenever you make a decision. You have to observe what's going on in your surroundings, orient yourself to them, decide, and then act. If you disrupt that OODA loop, it makes people pause. It kind of gets them stuck. A little bit like getting punch drunk. Like if you get punched in the face, you kind of don't know what's going on because you're trying to orient yourself. By being dynamic and reacting to an active threat, you can interrupt that OODA loop and you can save lives because while they're trying to figure out, well, they're not doing what I expect them to do, you can get out. So Alice, this is a super great program that we institute here in the schools in Seward. Is going all over the country. It's completely replacing the lockdown. It was developed after Columbine, after they realized that having students just sit there and hope not to get shot is not saving anybody's lives. They recognize the need for a dynamic response. It gives teachers and students options depending on what they see. Now, they didn't get rid of lockdown, they just gave more options, put more options inside the tool bag. So, ALICE stands for alert, lockdown, inform, counter, and activate. So, alert. It's your first notification of the event. The big thing with this one is preparation. We have to get people to overcome their denial, this whole it can't be happening, this can't happen to me mindset, and make them recognize the signs that yes, this is happening here, this is happening at this school at this time, so they can start implementing their protocol. So alert, they're going to call 911, they're going to let everybody in the school know. They'll get on the PA and say there's an active shooter, there's an active threat, there's something, and then they start their protocols from there. That's one of the most important steps because that's the step that gets everybody moving. Again, they didn't take away lockdown, right? If you are in an area where you can't get out or the shooter's nearby, lock everything down. Now, they're not just talking about locking doors and turning off lights. You barricade the room. Some schools actually bought specialized equipment that turns the door into a completely barricaded door. Otherwise, you can stack desks. You can do whatever you have to do. The big thing after you lock down, though, is you either prepare to evacuate or counter, which we'll get into in a minute. Okay, so you use a lockdown if evacuation isn't feasible, if it's not safe to get out. So inform. This is kind of a cool part. One of my favorite parts of ALICE is once everybody's locked down, the principal, usually the principal or whoever they designate, they'll watch because every school in America's got cameras now. They'll watch on the cameras and follow the intruder as he's walking around the school, and they will announce it over the PA system. So every single person in that school, including the shooter, knows that everybody knows where the intruder's at. The reason I like this is because it really disrupts that whole mentality that the shooter has that they're in charge because they can't surprise anybody because everybody in the school knows what they're doing. So it's totally destroying that OODA loop and kind of taking apart that whole God complex that some of these intruders have. So you communicate the intruder's location and direction in real time. You're going to utilize the PA system so everyone knows, and you're going to use clear, plain language. If the principal knows who that shooter is, they're going to mention them by name. All right, so Susie Q and John Anderson are heading down the south hallway. Now they're heading down the north hallway. That way everybody knows. It kind of takes away some of that power from the intruder and gives it back to the school. Counter. The big one about this is counter does not mean fight. ALICE is not teaching people to go out there, chase down the guy, and be a hero. Not the case at all. But unfortunately, there are times, like when that shooter in Sandy Hook forced his way into that classroom, where you have no other choice. So counter is using noise, movement, distance, and distraction. Okay? It reduces the shooter's accuracy. It confuses them. All we're doing is disrupting the OODA loop. You cannot shoot effectively at people if somebody's throwing cans or staplers or even papers at your face. Your body can't focus, your mind can't focus on two things at once. So if you're doing this stuff to someone while they're trying to aim, they're going to defend their face. They're going to do whatever they can to get that to stop before they can hurt you. So you can counter and use that as an excuse to get out. Again, this is not a this is a last resort situation. You're not running down the road or running down the hallway so you could throw a stapler at the back of the shooter's head. Not happening. But if they come in there and you have no other choice, we want to give the teachers, the students, everybody the confidence to know that they can do something. One of my favorite stories I always tell everybody was of a mugging that got thwarted in New York City. Guy was sitting on the subway. Bad guy puts gun in his face, says, "Give me all your money." The victim had a newspaper in his hand, had no idea what to do. So all he did was he lifted that newspaper up in front of his face and sat there. The mugger kept pointing his gun around the paper, trying to threaten him with it. He couldn't realize, his OODA loop couldn't comprehend the fact that he could just shoot through the paper. That's how important it is to disrupt that OODA loop. If it's not going the way they think that it is going, they may just give up and then evacuate. Obviously, this is the goal. Like I tell everybody when we do these kind of trainings, my hope is that by using Alice is if we have an intruder, they have an empty school. They're walking around and they don't know. Congratulations, because then the only person that they get to deal with is the police, and that's what we want to have happen. We want them engaged with us so they're not engaging with other people. So if it's safe to do so, get out. Do not evacuate in an orderly manner. We drive that point home. One of the things I actually enjoyed teaching this stuff with elementary school kids because they're just more fun. I tell kids that if they're going to lock down, they want to be little hedgehogs, and they curl up like little hedgehogs and be quiet. If they're going to evacuate, they're supposed to run like lizards. And it's funny watching all these kids running in all different directions. But that's what we want them to do. We want them to scatter, do not crowd up, just run and get out into the woods. In Seward, we have woods everywhere. We tell them to run into the woods. And then we establish a safe link-up spot away from the area. So once they get in the woods, everybody's going to work their way in. As police officers, I would rather be looking for a kid who's in the woods, who may not know how to get out of the woods, or dealing with a sprained ankle from somebody twisted their ankle, than having to worry about dead children. So Alice notes, this is not a step-by-step guide. That's one of the things we really have to drive home, because we as humans have a tendency to kind of go by a list, right? So it's not a step-by-step guide. It is just a list of options that you can use for whatever's in front of you. I think it needs to be practiced in schools often. I've had parents complain, and they've even pulled their kids out of our drills because my kid's too young and innocent to have to worry about active shooters, and why are we teaching kids this stuff this early? Well, we practice fire drills, and everybody is okay with it. And can anybody list or tell me the last time or the name of a fire that killed a kid in school? No, you can't, because we practice and we train. We have sprinkler systems. We have all this stuff in place to prevent fires from killing kids. We need to do the same thing with active threat incidents. We need to practice and we need to train. Yes, it sucks. I wish we lived in a world where we didn't have any of this stuff, where all I did as a school resource officer was hand out stickers, but that's not the world we live in. And keeping our head in the sand is just going to end up with more and more people dying. So, in conclusion, the big takeaway, if nothing else is taken away from this for law enforcement, the faster we can make contact, the faster the event is ended, the less life is lost. I know it seems kind of simple and straightforward, but it's a point that needs to be driven home a lot. The faster we can get this taken care of, the less life is lost. We need to understand, again, a situation is dynamic. You cannot have a formulaic response, because in a high-stress situation, that police officer, that SWAT member is going to stick to the formula instead of thinking outside of the box, because that tunnel vision that we talked about. And then our priorities are always going to be in this order. We have to stop the killing, then we stop the dying, and then we investigate the crime. I know it seems self-explanatory, but you have to remember that if, as a law enforcement officer, you're running through and there are people screaming and bleeding all around you, you can't stop the dying until you stop the killing. Thank you very much for listening. I apologize. I know this kind of went long, but again, this is a subject that I'm pretty passionate about. If you have any questions, you guys know how to get a hold of me via the classroom. Thank you. Bye.